UK Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn apologized Sunday for his party's crushing defeat in last week's general election. Boris Johnson's Conservative Party won a large majority in Parliament, taking 365 of the 650 seats in the House of Commons. Labour will now hold only 203 seats. That's their worst total since 1935. Corbyn defended his campaign as, quote, one of hope rather than fear, but it failed to gain traction with the party's working class base. He has pledged to stand down as party leader after what he calls a period of reflection. The process of picking his replacement is expected to begin early next year. Cybersecurity experts have warned of international interference in elections around the globe. But in last week's UK election, some of those spreading disinformation were the candidates themselves. Both Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party and Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Conservative Party spread misleading information online. In one instance, Corbyn cited documents that implied the Conservative Party would weaken the National Health Service. Those documents were ultimately linked to a Russian disinformation campaign. With the 2020 election fast approaching, what lessons can we learn from the UK election? For more, let's bring in Markos Kounalakis. He's a foreign affairs columnist for McClatchy. Markos, thanks very much for being with us. Like we saw in the U.S. in 2016, Russia was tied to a disinformation campaign in the UK's election. Will Russia continue to try to interfere in other countries' elections until there are repercussions on the world stage?
Elaine, you're right. There was this disinformation campaign. It was driven by the Russians. But you will, and to answer your question, you will see them engaging in other places where they have interests, where they're looking to sow chaos or create the type of tension within a society that allows for democracies or demands that democracies question the legitimacy of their electoral system and of their politics. But in this case, as we all have seen and what we're finding out is that it wasn't just foreign interference, it was actually domestic. And as you mentioned in the lead-in here, it was domestic forces, that is, the parties themselves that were as responsible as external players, whether they're Russia or other nations, who were actually having an effect and engaging in disinformation. I would say that this is what's happening. It is the popularization of propaganda. So propaganda has now become not just for professionals anymore, it's the democratization of disinformation for everyone.
Well, what was striking about the misleading information in this election is that it was spread by the parties themselves, both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. Did one party employ misinformation campaigns more than the other?
Well, we have to do the research to really see where those resources were being deployed, what type of disinformation was being put online, put into the heads of the electorate. But we do know that both parties engaged in it. If I were to judge from what I saw, I would probably give the Conservatives the edge up on this particular one. They had a tighter message. They were able to respond very quickly to the disinformation that was coming from the Labour Party. And they were able to just have a much more coherent type of strategy when it came to the emotional messages that were being propagated to the British electorate.
And do we know yet, Markos, will there be any consequences for this?
Well, the consequences are the elections themselves. I mean, when you are effective at doing this type of thing, then the consequences is you win an election. But it's not just the disinformation, right? It has to also feed into a larger message that seems coherent, that seems as if it's aligned with what the party stands for. And so there has to be the basis for an acceptance by those who are receiving the messages that, in fact, it lines up with what they expect already. So the consequences are electoral. They are somebody wins and somebody loses. And in this case, we saw significant losses and a significant win by the Conservatives and by Boris Johnson.
Well, there are few rules around internet campaigns, and it was fairly easy to determine if information was false or misleading. Can we expect these misinformation campaigns to become more sophisticated as more elections take place?
Well, they're becoming more sophisticated because the tools are becoming more sophisticated. You know, And the whole idea of disinformation and propaganda or misleading news is nothing new. I mean, it's been part and parcel of almost every election in a democratic open system. You know, back in the old days in Florida, you used to have a politician who would accuse his opponent of having a thespian sister who was living in wicked New York. And that was able to have resonance because there was an inability to counter that type of messaging that implied something nefarious, right? So what's changed is that it's become much more global. It's become instantaneous. There are no borders to the way this is done, and it's become totally democratized. If you have a computer or a phone, you can be just as good at propagating disinformation as a nation state, as Russia, as the the large IRA system, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia, as if you're just sitting in your bedroom tapping away with something that's emotionally gripping, interesting, can find an audience.
Well, now that the public is more aware about election interference online, are voters still shrugging off the notion that everything they read online may not be true?
Yeah, I think that's true, Elaine. And I think what you're finding is also a generational shift. I think that the digital native generation, that generation which is coming up right now out of high school, in college, is much more sophisticated in the way that it understands the use of these tools than my generation, quite frankly. And so you're seeing a generational shift in terms of susceptibility to this type of disinformation, but you're also seeing, perhaps in the early stages, a reliance on those brands and those news organizations that traditionally have developed really sophisticated ways and traditional ways of bringing true information. For instance, you know, if you look behind me, there's a whole studio, and if you think about newspapers, they have entire printing plants. So there's an entire infrastructure guaranteeing the type of information that's coming to a reader, a citizen, a voter, is backed up by a larger institution. Now, a lot of this stuff can be faked with deep fake type video, for example. So you really are going to have to grow into this new environment and understand the changes before an electorate and a voter can adapt to this. And the technology is going to keep changing. The sophistication is going to continue to get better. And so it's going to be not an arms race, but a harms race. Who can hurt the other candidate better, more sophisticatedly, faster?
Well, Facebook has said it will not screen political ads for factual accuracy. Are these misinformation campaigns interfering with elections the new normal? And if so, is there anything being done to prevent it?
Sure, there are things being done on the margins. There's actually some stuff being done at Facebook, for example, at Twitter and other places where Twitter is no longer going to engage with political advertising, right? So, but the volume of this is so massive. The speed of it is so immediate that any types of actions that are being taken are going to always lag behind the what happens immediately, right? So one of the things that used to be true in television is that we would have a time lag, right, between a live production. So if I were speaking to you, there would be a bump in case I'd said something incendiary, false, you know, or even offensive to the viewership. We don't have that time lag on the internet. I mean, when you hit send, it is online. It is instantaneous. So maybe some of these tools would be helpful to try and create the same types of speed rails or speed bumps so that we can maybe allow for those who are trying to regulate and those organizations that are trying to be responsible, giving them the tools to be able to do that. But we're not there yet. Right.
It's a new reality that we're in now. Markos Kounalakis. Markos, thank you very much.
Thanks, Elaine.